The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt by John Bellairs, Chapter 6. Johnny sat rigid and still. He felt cold creeping over his body, as if he were slowly turning into a block of ice. The square of paper had been left on the car seat by someone who had wanted him to find it. The drawing was familiar to him in a hazy way. He had seen it in a history book somewhere, and its meaning seemed very clear to Johnny. It was a death threat, but who was threatening him and why? Suddenly Johnny looked up. Through the windshield he could see Mr. Brentlinger walking down the sidewalk toward the car. Johnny made a very quick decision. He scrunched the drawing up into a ball in his hand and stuffed it into his pants pocket. He really did not want to discuss this with Mr. Brentlinger, or to be told that the drawing was just an ad for a Halloween dance, or a free gift from somebody's funeral parlor. He had had enough of calm, reasonable advice from the professor. All he wanted was time to think and figure out what to do. When the station wagon pulled into the parking lot at Camp Chocora, Johnny thanked Mr. Brentlinger, got out of the car, and ran up to his room to get his baseball glove. Johnny had seen the kids playing softball as he rode back along the road toward the camp. He loved to play, even though he was not very good at it, but he was always hoping that somehow, mysteriously, he would turn into a better fielder and hitter. Now, as he raced through the long grass, his mind kept coming back to the evil thing that was wadded up in his pocket. He had to tell somebody about it or he would burst. He couldn't call the professor again, so then who? As he jogged nearer to the mob of yelling, gesturing boys, Johnny began to grin broadly. He waved excitedly. There was Fergie! Fergie was sitting in the long grass, looking absolutely nonchalant as he chewed on a tufted weed. He was on the team that was up to bat. It was a chilly day, and so he was wearing an old scruffy gray sweatshirt with Cyclops Athletic Club printed on it in white block letters across the front. "Hi, Fergie," said Johnny. He slumped down on the grass. Johnny tried hard to smile, but when he thought of the wadded paper in his pocket, his smile turned to a tense frown. Fergie looked at Johnny curiously. "Hey, what's the matter with you? Did you bet on the Germans to win the Second World War?" Normally Johnny would have laughed, but he was not in a very jokey mood. He dug his hand into his pants pocket and pulled out the piece of paper. Carefully he uncrumpled it, smoothed it out on his knees, and handed it to Fergie. "I found this in the car when I went downtown with Mr. Brentlinger. I think it's a death threat." Fergie squinted at the crumpled drawing and laughed. "A death threat? Are you out of your jug? This is one of those things from that book, what's his name? The Pilgrim's Maid, so kids would learn their ABCs. I looked at it in the library once. This one's for the letter Y. What made you think it was a death threat?" "Somebody left it on the seat where I was sitting in Mr. Brentlinger's car. Don't you see? They're after me on account of how I know where the will is, and—" Johnny paused and stared at the ground. He bit his lip and felt his cheeks getting red with embarrassment. He had been running on because he was excited and scared, and he had not stopped to think that this would make absolutely no sense for Fergie, and now Fergie would probably decide that Johnny was weird, and he would get up and walk away, and that would be the end of their friendship. But that was not what happened. Fergie stared at Johnny, but it was an interested stare. There was a gleam in his eyes and a faint curling smile on his lips. "Hey," he said slowly, "are you mixed up in something? You can tell me. I won't rat on you. Come on." So Johnny started to tell Fergie about Staunton Herald and the lost Glomus will and the table with the weird collection of objects on it. While they talked, there was a lot of yelling and screaming going on behind their backs. Fergie's team was knocking the cover off the ball. Pretty soon the bases were loaded. "Hey, Fergie!" somebody yelled. "You're up!" "Oops, excuse me, I'll be right back," said Fergie, and he scrambled to his feet. He picked up a bat and loped toward the plate. As Johnny watched, Fergie got ready to hit. The pitcher barreled the ball in, and Fergie swung. It was an awkward, lunging swing, and he missed. Johnny felt sympathetic and got ready to cheer Fergie up when he struck out. But then the ball came whizzing toward the plate again, and Fergie swung and connected. Whack! The ball sailed upward in a high, beautiful arc. It flew out over the head of the center fielder and came down in some bushes at the far end of the field. Fergie raced around the bases, and all the boys on his team whooped and cheered. After he crossed home plate, Fergie stumbled back to where he'd been sitting before. He sat down, crossed his legs, and smiled modestly. "Natural ability," he said, brushing off an imaginary speck of dust from his sweatshirt. "Okay, now, you want to tell me some more about this trouble you're in?" Johnny told Fergie the rest of what he knew and what he guessed. He told him that he thought the lost Glomus will Must be out at the estate called Staunton Herald. Fergie listened to all this thoughtfully. He nodded sometimes or shook his head, and now and then he would say something like, "Hot dog, how about that?" or, "Boy, that old guy must really have been out of his jug." Out of his jug was one of Fergie's favorite expressions. Finally, Johnny was finished. He folded his arms and glanced nervously at Fergie. "What do you think?" he asked. Fergie was quiet a second before answering. "I think you're the only kid I know who's ever had a death threat handed to him. Honest. I never heard of it happening before." Johnny felt confused and kind of angry. First, Fergie had said that the picture wasn't a death threat, and now he said that it was. Was he trying to be funny? "It's not like the Congressional Medal of Honor," he snapped back. "I mean, I might get killed." "Yeah, you might," Fergie said, this in an abstracted, dreamy way. It was plain that his mind was elsewhere. As Johnny stared at him anxiously, Fergie hummed and gazed off into space. Suddenly, a light came into his eyes. He snapped his fingers and turned to Johnny. "Hey," he said, "you know what we ought to do?" "What?" "We ought to sneak out of our rooms tonight and go see if we can find a way to get into that Statler Harrison place. What do you say?" "It's Staunton Herald," said Johnny severely. He hated to hear people mispronounce names. Would not enjoy me reading this book then. "Statler, Hilton, Staunton Herald. What's the difference?" said Fergie in an irritated shrug. "Come on, answer the question. Do you want to go or don't you?" Johnny hemmed and hawed. He had a holy terror of violating rules and regulations, and camp regulations said you couldn't leave your dormitory between lights out and reveille. "We can't go," said Johnny fretfully. "If we get caught, they'll throw us out, and my grandpa and grandma will really feel awful if that happens." Fergie snorted disgustedly. "Oh, come on, Dixon. Are you going to spend the rest of your life wrapped up in a blanket in your bedroom? The only way to have any fun is to break the rules sometimes. Come on, I'll meet you at 11 p.m. out by the flagpole. There's a path over there," Fergie said, pointing off toward a mass of bushes near the tennis courts, "and it leads out toward the road. You know the one we're hiking on? You know the one we were hiking on when we saw the old place? We'll just go out and peek at the old dump and come right back. Who's to know? You'll be in bed before anybody knows you left. What do you say?" Johnny still looked hesitant. Eckelbecker will turn me in if he finds out I've gone out." Fergie looked grim. "You tell that lard bucket that Byron Q. Ferguson told him to keep his trap shut unless he wants to have his ears tied into a bowknot behind his head." Johnny was torn with indecision. The professor was always telling him that he ought to be more adventurous. Maybe he ought to quit worrying and live a little. "Oh, okay," he said finally. "I'll be there." At about 11:05 that night, Johnny was standing out by the flagpole waiting. It was a chilly, raw night with a fine mist in the air, and he was shivering as he peered up at the overcast sky. He was wearing his Notre Dame warm-up jacket over his pajama tops, and he also had on his blue jeans and his heavy socks and tennis shoes. He looked off toward the log buildings. So where was Fergie? Had he chickened out in spite of all his brave talk? But then Johnny saw a shape moving toward him. Fergie was sprinting across the wet grass, carrying something in his hand. Suddenly, Johnny realized what it was, a flashlight. And then he felt very stupid. He had a flashlight, but it was in his suitcase. He had been so nervous and flustered about the whole deal that he had forgotten to bring it. Fergie arrived panting. "Hi," he whispered. "Glad you didn't cop out on me. You bring a flashlight?" "I don't have one," said Johnny untruthfully. Is that all right?" "Nah," said Fergie, grinning. "You get 3 demerits and no supper tonight." "Sure, it's all right. Stop being such a fuss, Budget. This flashlight here is one of those super-duper sealed beam jobbies. It shines for miles. So don't worry. Let's get started." Fergie and Johnny jogged off into the drizzly darkness. After a couple of minutes, Fergie switched on the wonderful sealed beam flashlight. The effect was quite dramatic. A long bar of pale light shot out into the gloom. As Johnny watched Fergie move the beam back and forth, it lit up the hump of the pitcher's mound on the baseball diamond, and then it moved slowly across the mass of bushes beyond the field. The beam picked out a cleft in the wall of shrubbery. "Aha!" said Fergie. "Aha! And other expressions of delight. Come on, we've got it knocked." The two boys marched on. They reached the edge of the wide grassy field and plunged into the gap in the bushes. It was a narrow path, and they had to go single file. Fergie went first with the light. Wet leaves slapped across Johnny's face, and he put out his arm to fend them off. His head was sopping wet now, and water was running down his neck. He thought about his grandma and how she believed that if you got wet out in the rain, you might die of pneumonia. Poor grandma. Johnny hoped that she was really going to get better. Silently, he said a Hail Mary and an Our Father for her. After what seemed like hours of slopping along Through wet underbrush, the boys came out onto a road covered with wet gravel. Johnny had a vague idea that they were walking through a forest. But when he looked up, he couldn't tell where the trees ended and the sky began. Fergie's light flashed out through the mist like a sword, and neither boy spoke. Johnny began to brood about the mysterious place they had set out to explore. The old mansion was evil-looking, even in bright sunlight. What would it be like at night? Fergie grabbed Johnny's arm. "Hey, what was that?" he said sharply, and he sounded alarmed. Both boys halted and stood dead still, listening. Off to their left, they heard noises. Crunch, crunch, crackle, crunch. Somebody or something was thrashing around the wet underbrush. Johnny wanted to run, but he had his pride. If Fergie was going to stand his ground, then so would he. "Hey, what the heck do you think that was?" Fergie was trying to sound brave, but Johnny could hear the trembling in his voice. "I don't know. Maybe it was a dog." "Nah, too much noise for a dog. I'd say it was a hunter. Only any hunter who is out here on a lousy night like this would have to be out of his jug. Some old bum, maybe." Johnny didn't think it was a bum. In his mind's eye, he saw a Frankensteinish creature dripping green slime from its horny paws. Any minute now, it would come charging out of the darkness at them, uttering strange cries and lusting for their blood. Suddenly, the noise in the underbrush died away. Fergie took a deep breath and let it out. "Hot dog," he must have said. "Hot dog," he said, grinning. "He must have gone away." Fergie chuckled. His old, jaunty, swaggering self was coming back. "Let's move it. It's just a little ways down the road to the old place." On the boys hiked till the wet gravel went squanch, squanch under their feet. The mist turned into a steady drizzle. Johnny kept straining to see, but he could not make out much except more road and vague leafy shadows, crowding in close on either side. Finally, though, as they started down a hill, the close shadows of the trees and bushes fell away. The long beam of Fergie's flashlight swerved to the left and picked out the heavy ornamented stone arch with its swings and urns and with its swags and urns and columns. They were there. They had reached Staunton Herald, and standing under the arch, waiting for them, was a man. He wore a yellow rubber raincoat and a black rubber rain hat with a wide floppy brim. Under his armpit, the man held a flashlight, and in his hands was a rifle pointed straight at Johnny and Fergie. And that's the end of Chapter 6.